Hey everyone, tonight we're heading west. Not the wild, gunslinging, gold-hungry west you've seen in old movies, but the quieter, stranger one. The one that existed when the map still faded into nothing, when lanterns burned low and every creek in the dark felt older than it should have been. So before we start, take a moment to settle in, turn the lights down, maybe let the soft hum of your fan fill the room. If you've got a warm drink nearby, this is the moment to take that first slow sip. Because tonight, we're not chasing outlaws or legends, we're drifting into the forgotten hours of the American frontier. There are stories hidden in that silence, the kind that never made it into textbooks. Stories of lonely cabins that stood too far from neighbors, of winds that carried voices no one could explain, of towns that appeared, thrived, and vanished so completely that the earth seemed to swallow their memory whole. The frontier was a place of hope, yes, but also a place of heavy quiet. And in that quiet, something ancient seemed to linger, something that made even the bravest pioneers pause when the fire went out, and the only sound left was the prairie breathing in the dark. Before we dive in, if you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through the stranger corners of history, make sure to subscribe and tap the little bell so you'll never miss the next quiet story we tell together. So, welcome, wherever you're listening from, whatever time it is for you. We're stepping into a place where history moves slowly, where the stars hang lower, and where midnight doesn't feel quite empty. This is why the American frontier felt cursed at midnight. Let's begin. Before settlers came, the land stretched endlessly beneath an ocean of stars. It was a landscape so wide, so untamed, that even the wind seemed to move cautiously through it. The earth at night was not silent, yet its sounds were ancient and patient. The sigh of grass bending under the weight of dew, the soft murmur of rivers turning in their sleep, the faint rustle of leaves that had never known the cut of an axe. The land breathed slowly. It did not hurry. It existed as it always had, under skies that seemed too large for human thought. Across what would one day be called the American frontier, the rhythm of life followed patterns older than memory. In the great grasslands, tall grasses rose higher than a rider on horseback would one day sit. Their roots reached deep, binding the soil in place, holding the memory of fire, drought, and rain. At night, when the winds passed over them, the prairie seemed to whisper, a steady, endless exhalation. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and the faint sweetness of flowering plants. Fireflies blinked among the reeds, faint and rhythmic, their glow like slow breathing in the dark. To the east, forests spread thick and deep. Oak, beech, pine, and hickory covered the rolling hills, forming shadows upon shadows where moonlight dared not fall. Each sound there carried far, the soft padding of a fox, the creak of a falling branch, the flutter of a single bird disturbed in its roost. Rivers ran through those forests, black under the night, carrying the reflections of stars along their surface. Their currents were gentle, their banks wild and untamed, lined with cattails and willows that leaned toward the water as if listening to something below. Above it all stretched the night sky, vast, cold, and impossibly bright. The Milky Way arched from horizon to horizon, clear and sharp, unchallenged by any human light. To those who would have walked these lands in those distant centuries, the sky would not have been an abstract ceiling of stars, but a living expanse, a place of orientation, of mystery, of quiet significance. The absence of towns and lamps meant darkness was complete, and in that darkness the heavens became overwhelming. It was said that under such a sky, time itself seemed to slow, folding into the measured pulse of the natural world. In those epochs the land belonged to no one, though many lived upon it. Indigenous nations, the Osage, the Lakota, the Pawnee, the Cherokee, and countless others, moved across these spaces with rhythms that matched the Earth's own. They knew the migration of animals, the path of stars, the timing of fire and regrowth. To them the night was not empty but alive, filled with the songs of insects, the calls of distant animals, and the unseen presence of spirits woven into the land. Firelight was not defiance of the dark, but a communion with it, a soft glow against the infinite. Each night carried a weight that modern life has forgotten. The air cooled quickly once the sun had gone, and a deep silence gathered, not the silence of emptiness, but of immensity. The wind shifted direction as temperatures fell, and the land seemed to sigh as it exhaled the warmth of day. The stars wheeled above in slow procession. No clock measured the hours, no engine disturbed the rhythm, only the sounds of the earth, the cheer of crickets, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, the distant splash of something unseen in a river bend, filled the world with a soft and steady continuity. Far to the west, the first hint of what would become desert stirred in the night, mesas and dry plains glowing faintly under the moon. The sand held the day's heat and released it slowly, so that even after midnight, the air shimmered with warmth. Coyotes called in the distance, their voices echoing off stone and fading into the emptiness. In the mountains the cold was sharper, snow lay unmoving on distant peaks, catching the faint light and gleaming like old silver. The high air was thin and still, carrying only the sound of its own quietness. In this world, life moved in cycles too broad for human understanding. Grasslands burned and renewed themselves. Herds of bison thundered across the plains in migrations that shook the earth. Wolves followed, ravens shadowed them in flight. Forests aged and fell and grew again. Each part of the landscape existed in patient cooperation with the rest. Nothing hurried, nothing broke the stillness for long. Even death felt slow and untroubled, a returning to soil, to wind, to the quiet pulse beneath the ground. It was, in every sense, a breathing world, and its breath was slow, deep, and rhythmic, the exhalation of centuries untouched by boundary or conquest. In those days, before names were written on maps, and before trails cut through the wild, there was only the sound of the land itself. To walk across it, then, would have been to feel small and unmeasured, to feel the planet itself shifting gently beneath one's feet. Night after night, under a vault of stars, the earth existed in its own kind of peace. But peace in nature is never permanent. It waits, patient and unmoving, until the first sound of footsteps disturbs it, until firelight returns not as ceremony, but as settlement, and the soft sigh of grass gives way to the echo of axe and wheel. That quiet world, untouched and unhurried, was already beginning to change, though it did not yet know it. For somewhere east of that endless horizon, people had begun to move, westward, slowly, steadily, carrying with them light, noise, fences, and the restless pulse of civilization. The land, still breathing, waited, and the silence began to hold its breath. When the first wanderers came, they did not yet call it a frontier. It was only the edge of what they knew, a space that stretched so far that even the maps refused to imagine it. The horizon seemed endless, the ground unmarked by road or fence, and the stars looked close enough to brush with the palm of a hand. Those who arrived first came not as conquerors, but as travelers following rivers, game, or rumor. Their fires burned low, pale circles of light, swallowed almost instantly by the immensity of night. They were not many at first: traders, fur trappers, explorers, men who carried what they needed in small packs and measured distance by the sun. They found themselves surrounded by a kind of silence that did not yield. The forest and the plain seemed to observe them without emotion. Even the animals appeared to pause, watching. Coyotes lingered at a distance, their eyes reflecting firelight like dull amber coins. Wolves moved soundlessly, beyond the reach of vision. The air itself seemed to listen. Night on the early frontier was unlike night anywhere else. It arrived suddenly, as if the horizon swallowed the sun whole. Shadows grew long, then vanished, and what had seemed open and welcoming in daylight turned vast and unknowable. The wind moved differently after sunset, slower, deeper, whispering through grass and pine, as though speaking a language the newcomers did not understand. Some wrote that it sounded almost human, though they could never decide if it was mournful or merely old. When the explorers built their first camps, they did so near water, where the ground was level and the air felt gentler. They placed their fires carefully, as if the light itself might offend the night. Around these flames they told quiet stories, not yet of ghosts or curses, but of distance, of loneliness, of the strange awareness that there was more space than they could comprehend. In their journals, written by flickering light, they described a silence that pressed against their ears, a darkness that seemed thicker than air. The world around them felt alive, but disinterested, vast but watching. The earliest fur traders and trappers, the forerunners of the great western expansion, moved through this country one creek and valley at a time. They crossed what would become Missouri, Kansas, and Nebraska, following old animal trails that cut across the plains. Each night, when they stopped, the world felt unchanged, untouched by their presence. Their lanterns cast brief halos that dissolved into the blackness, leaving the impression of small, floating worlds surrounded by nothing. In the distance, owls called with long, hollow notes. Sometimes a branch cracked. Sometimes there was only the slow breath of the wind. They carried tools, rifles, maps drawn from memory, and journals to record what they saw. But what they saw at night, they often could not describe. Some spoke of lights on distant hills, perhaps other travelers, perhaps fireflies, perhaps imagination shaped by isolation. Others mentioned voices that seemed to come from nowhere, faint echoes carried by the wind. When morning came, the landscape would be unchanged, bright and empty, giving no sign that anything had moved during the night at all. These early wanderers were in many ways historians of silence. Each step westward was a record of distance measured against solitude. Their lanterns, dim and uncertain, stood as the first defiance of the wild night, fragile, flickering beacons in a world that had known only starlight for millennia. Yet even as they burned, the darkness seemed to bend around them, patient, waiting. The fire was temporary. The night was endless. Over time, as trails became faintly marked and small trading posts appeared, those isolated points of light multiplied. Forts rose on the banks of wide rivers, their walls of timber reflecting the glow of oil lamps and campfires. Inside, men spoke in low tones about weather, about supplies, about the long months without sight of a new face. Outside those walls, the prairie stretched silent and unbroken. Beyond the range of firelight, it was as though the world ceased to exist. The settlers felt the edge of it like a weight, the sense that something immeasurable began just beyond the reach of sight. The journals that survive from these years often remark on the feeling of exposure. Men who had survived storms, wild animals, and hunger still wrote that it was the stillness that unnerved them most. The night seemed too aware, too deliberate. It had its own rhythm, the cry of a distant animal, the rattle of wind through dry grass, the slow crackle of a dying fire. In those sounds they sometimes heard patterns, like breathing, like footsteps, though they knew no one else was near. To sleep in that silence was to become a small part of it, to surrender to its vast patience. The land itself seemed to resist human measure. Distances could not be trusted, landmarks shifted under changing light. A hill seen at dusk vanished by moonrise. Rivers reflected the sky so perfectly that travelers lost their bearings. Many wrote that they felt watched, not by animals or enemies, but by the land itself. It was as if the wilderness, after so many centuries of quiet, was observing the newcomers with mild curiosity, waiting to see whether they would remain or pass like the wind. In the mornings, frost would cling to grass blades and tent ropes, turning the world to glass. Smoke from dying fires rose straight into a pale sky. The travelers would pack their things in silence, mount their horses, and move on. Behind them the grass straightened, the embers cooled, and the night reclaimed its emptiness. The traces of their passing vanished almost immediately, leaving the land unchanged. The first lanterns at the edge of nowhere marked the beginning of something irreversible. Each light was a promise, or perhaps a warning, that the stillness would not last forever, that the great breathing of the earth would one day be interrupted by the restless heartbeat of civilization. Yet in those early years, before towns, before fences, before the echo of steel on rail, the night remained stronger. The wild still owned its silence, and the small flames of human presence flickered like thoughts in a dreaming world, fragile, temporary, destined to fade. For now, the land remained vast, and the fires, small, and in the deep hours before dawn, when the wind whispered through the empty plains, it was impossible to tell whether the earth was sleeping or listening. The first cabins rose like hesitant thoughts at the edges of the wilderness, rough-hewn walls of pine or oak, each one a small defiance against the enormity of the land. They stood among trees that had never known the sound of a hammer, trees that for centuries had whispered only to wind and rain. In the pale light of dawn, smoke drifted thinly from stone chimneys, rising into the cool air and disappearing between the branches. Around these lonely dwellings, the forest seemed to press close, as if curious about the sudden presence of light and noise in its long silence. To live in such a place was to dwell inside the breath of the woods. Every movement carried an echo, the swing of an axe, the crack of splitting wood, the hollow thump of a log falling to the ground. These sounds drifted far between the trunks, fading and returning in strange rhythms. At night, when the fire burned low, and the air grew heavy with damp earth and pine, that same echo turned against the settlers. They said the forest had a way of listening, of holding each sound a little too long before letting it fade. The first settlers described the nights as endless. They had known darkness before, but not this kind, not the deep, breathing blackness that gathered beneath the trees. The air was thick with the smell of moss and smoke, crickets hummed, frogs croaked from unseen pools, and sometimes the distant cry of an owl would pierce the quiet, sounding too near, as though the forest itself had thrown its voice. When the wind shifted, the trees groaned softly, their branches rubbing together with a sound like whispering speech. Inside their cabins, the settlers would lie awake, listening. The walls, still rough and thin, did little to keep the night outside. Every creak of timber, every soft brush of wind against bark seemed amplified. The forest had its own pulse, slow and deliberate, and it moved through the night like breath through a sleeping body. Some claimed that after a few months in the woods, one could tell when the forest was calm and when it was watching. The trees themselves stood like sentinels, their trunks black in the starlight, their crowns shifting against the faint glow of the moon. In the faint wind, the canopy moved with a sound like murmured conversation. During those first winters, when snow fell heavy and muffled the world, that sound grew stranger, the snow creaking under its own weight, branches snapping in the distance like quiet gunfire, the cold air carrying every noise too clearly. Men who had felled trees all day would wake in the night and swear they heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. In the morning there would be no tracks, only snow smooth and untouched. The loneliness was absolute. Many of these cabins stood miles apart, separated by forests so thick that travelers had to mark trees with axes to find their way home. A visit from another family might come once a season, and in between there was only the whisper of wind and the company of one's own thoughts. The settlers learned to read the forest as if it were alive, to notice when the birds went silent, when the owls called early, when the wind changed direction. Each sound meant something, though they could never quite say what. For the people who lived there, the woods were both home and presence, not malicious, not kind, simply aware. Some spoke of a feeling that settled in the air after dusk, as if the forest drew closer once the sun was gone. Shadows lengthened, deepened, and sometimes seemed to move against the shape of the moon. A stump might appear like a crouched figure until you stared too long, and then it seemed to shift when you looked away. Even the smallest fire made strange shapes dance across the walls, blurring the line between what was real and what was imagination. And yet, amid the unease, there was beauty in that solitude. The smell of burning wood and damp pine, the faint sparkle of frost on branches, the slow drift of mist between trunks at dawn, These became the rhythm of life. The settlers learned the patience of trees. They learned to move quietly, to notice the weight of silence, to understand that noise had a cost. Each fallen tree was not only lumber but an interruption, a voice removed from the chorus of wind and leaf. The forest seemed to mourn each clearing, its edges sighing as if something unseen had been disturbed. The journals that survive from these years tell of nights too quiet to sleep. They speak of men who woke to silence so complete it rang in their ears, of women who felt that the air inside their cabins pressed inward, heavy with stillness. They wrote of owls that called too many times, of dogs that stared at the tree line without barking. They described it without fear, but with something slower, a weariness, a surrender to the understanding that the forest was not empty and never had been. In the morning, sunlight would pour through the cracks in the logs and scatter across the floor, warming the cold air. The unease of night would retreat, and the forest would seem benign again, full of the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves. But as evening returned and the light thinned, the quiet deepened once more. The forest resumed its patient listening. Each cabin stood as a small island in that endless expanse of trees, its thin smoke curling upward like a fragile thread connecting earth to sky. And each night, when the fires dimmed and the voices faded, the woods leaned close again, their whispers blending with the wind. The settlers built their homes, cleared their fields and lit their lamps, but the forest remained vast and ancient, unmoved by their presence. It had seen ages come and go before them, and it would endure long after their walls had turned back to soil. It listened as it always had, quietly, endlessly, with a patience that only the earth could understand. There was a moment near the end of each day when the forest held its breath. The sun, heavy and red, drifted low behind the trees, and the last light struck the trunks at an angle that made them seem almost translucent. It was then that the sound would begin, the clean, deliberate crack of steel against wood. It echoed strangely, distant yet close, as if the forest itself were repeating it, unwilling to let the noise vanish too soon. Each swing of an axe was a small interruption in an ancient quiet. For centuries the wilderness had known only the soft noises of its own life, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds, the murmur of wind. Now the rhythm of human effort entered that pattern, steady, percussive, intrusive. The sound carried far beyond the clearing, bouncing from trunk to trunk, fading into hollows, and returning faintly from unseen depths. It was both labor and declaration, the forest learning that it was no longer alone. The men who wielded those axes worked with methodical patience. They stood in worn boots among roots and ferns, their breath steaming in the cool air, their hands numbed by repetition. Around them lay chips of pale wood that smelled sweet and raw, the scent cutting sharply through the damp scent of earth. With each strike, a small tremor passed through the handle, through the arm, through the body, a physical connection between human and tree, between intention and resistance. When the first trees fell, they did so slowly, with a long groaning sound that was less a crash than a sigh. The ground shuddered faintly when they struck, sending up a puff of dust and needles. For a moment afterward, there was always silence, a kind of stunned quiet, as though the forest itself was considering what had happened. Then the smaller noises returned. Insects, wind, the faint drip of sap from the wounded trunk. The rhythm of life continued, but altered. Something irreversible had begun. In those early settlements, wood cutting was constant. Trees became walls, roofs, tools, and fuel. Each one felled meant warmth for the winter or shelter against the rain. Yet as practical as it was, the act carried an undertone the settlers could not name, a sense that they were disturbing something not entirely passive. Many wrote of strange echoes that followed the sound of an axe, as though a second fainter blow replied from deeper in the woods. Some heard the sound at night, even after they had stopped working, distant and rhythmic, as if the trees themselves were remembering. The light of dusk made the work seem both holy and mournful. Shadows stretched long between the stumps, the air filled with the smell of sap and smoke. The men would rest their axes against logs and watch the horizon dim, the world turning blue and still. The day's heat faded, and a coolness rose from the ground. In that hour when neither day nor night truly ruled, the landscape seemed to listen again. Birds grew quiet, insects slowed their hum, and the forest exhaled in long, invisible sighs. Those who lived closest to the trees spoke of how the forest changed its tone after the first clearings were made. The old paths grew silent as though the animals had retreated deeper. Streams once bright with movement now reflected empty sky. Even the wind moved differently, carrying with it a faint note of absence. The settlers, though proud of their progress, sometimes paused to listen, sensing the difference but unable to name it. The wilderness, once vast and formless, now had edges, boundaries shaped by human intent. When the moon rose, the stumps cast dark circles across the frost, the fallen trunks lay in rows, their rings exposed, each one a record of years unremembered, centuries of growth counted and ended in a single day. Some settlers kept pieces of those rings, tracing their fingers along the pale spirals, marveling at the time contained within. Others burned the wood without thought, its smoke rising briefly before fading into the cold night air. And still the sound continued, the hollow strike of metal against bark, echoing through valleys, over ridges, down to the rivers that once marked the limits of the known world. Each swing was a heartbeat in a new rhythm, a quiet defiance of the old order. The forest did not resist, it only received, absorbed, remembered. Those who lingered outside at twilight sometimes thought they heard faint returns, a delayed echo, impossibly distant, answering from somewhere beyond the trees. It was never quite in time, never quite clear, but it carried the same hollow timbre, as if the land itself were slowly learning the sound of its own undoing. By morning the echoes were gone, replaced by birdsong and the steady hum of insects. The settlers would rise, eat their meager breakfasts, and return to their work. Another tree, another wall, another space cleared from the endless green. The pattern repeated, day after day, year after year, until the horizon itself seemed changed, the breath of the forest shortened, its voice quieter, its silence less complete. But in the evenings, when the light grew thin and the air grew still, the old sound returned again, faint, rhythmic, and patient. The hollow sound of an axe at dusk. It was the beginning of permanence, and the beginning of forgetting. The nights were long on the frontier, longer than any that had come before. When the fires burned low, and the wind quieted, the darkness seemed to stretch forever, deep and endless as a sea. The settlers would sit beside the dim glow of a candle or an embering hearth, and in that small trembling light they would write. They wrote of the cold, of the quiet, of the way time itself felt different after sunset. Hours moved slowly, heavy with stillness, and each sound, a creak of the wall, a flicker of flame, seemed to belong to a world too vast to be fully known. They looked often at the stars. Out here, far from towns or lanterns, the night sky revealed its full weight, an ocean of white sparks suspended in blackness. The stars were endless, patient, unmoving, and yet they seemed almost nearer than the next cabin miles away. Many settlers admitted in their journals that the stars gave them comfort, though in a strange and melancholy way. They reminded them of distance, of how small they were, and how long the earth had been quiet before their arrival. On those cold nights when breath hung like smoke in the air, loneliness took on the shape of a presence. Some compared it to weather, something that arrived and settled, unavoidable, unexplainable. It came quietly, like frost, seeping into thoughts until even silence began to sound alive. The ticking of a cooling stove, the low hiss of wind beneath a door, the faint scratching of branches against the roof, these became the conversation of the night. A few settlers, especially those who lived entirely alone, began to hear things that could not be explained. They spoke of voices faint as echoes, half-heard words that seemed to rise from the stillness itself. One diary, found years later in a collapsed cabin near the Missouri River, described a voice that came only when the fire was dying, soft and indistinct, speaking in a language the writer could not recognize. Another mentioned the sound of footsteps outside in the snow, too measured to be animal, too far from the door to be human. When morning came, there were never any prints. It is possible, of course, that isolation played tricks on the mind. Loneliness, like hunger, has its own kind of delirium. The endless dark, the monotonous sound of wind, the weight of cold, all could shape the imagination into strange forms. But the settlers themselves rarely dismissed these experiences as illusion. To them, the land simply had its own memory, and sometimes it spoke. They found comfort where they could, in letters that took months to arrive, in the faint glow of the hearth, in the ritual of prayer before bed. But even those gestures carried an echo of distance. To pray in such silence was to send words into an abyss, hoping they reached something that might still be listening. The sound of one's own voice felt foreign in such quiet, as if it disturbed something older and greater than human company. Outside, the stars continued their slow drift across the sky, indifferent and cold. The settlers knew them by name: Orion, Cassiopeia, the North Star that guided travelers home. But out here, those constellations seemed less like guides and more like watchers. They had seen countless lives pass beneath them, countless fires flare and fade. The settlers sometimes wondered if the stars remembered all that they had seen, if the same cold light had once fallen on others who had stood alone in the dark, hearing the same wind. Winter deepened the loneliness. Snow fell without sound, softening the world until even footsteps vanished beneath its weight. The horizon disappeared, and with it, the sense of direction. Days became indistinguishable from nights. Time blurred, stretched and folded in on itself. In such isolation, thought grew strange, not frightening, but detached, drifting like the smoke of a dying candle. Many of the journals from this period carry an unusual calm. Their writers do not describe fear or panic, but a kind of acceptance, a surrender to the slowness of time. One wrote that the silence was as if the air were filled with waiting, another that the stars are the only things that move now. They lived within that waiting, their lives reduced to the simplest patterns: chop, mend, eat, sleep, wake, endure. And always the night returned, vast, soundless, heavy. The stars hung low and still, seeming to pulse faintly in the cold air. Between them lay a darkness so deep it felt almost solid, like something that could be touched if one only reached far enough. Some settlers would sit by the window for hours, watching the sky, feeling that the universe itself was leaning in, vast, ancient, and not entirely empty. By spring, many would forget the nights, or choose to. The days grew bright, the work returned, and the forest silence gave way to birdsong again. But deep in memory the winter nights remained, the candlelight flickering on rough wood, the faint hiss of snow against the roof, the slow heartbeat of isolation echoing beneath the stars. And perhaps, even as they slept, the land listened, remembering their small presence, their breath, their fear, their hope, all swallowed gently into the long patience of the dark. There came a point where the trees thinned and vanished, and the land unfolded into something larger, a quiet that no forest could hold. The plains began where the horizon lost all definition, where the sky seemed to descend and merge with the earth in a haze of pale silver. At night, under the light of the moon, it was as though the entire world had been flattened into a single breath, vast, unbroken, and softly moving. The settlers who crossed this land wrote that it was beautiful, but not in a way that welcomed them. The plains were not a place to rest, only to pass through, a landscape that existed in slow motion, indifferent to the living. Grass rose in endless waves, bending under the wind, like a sea that forgot how to break. Even the stars seemed farther away here, diluted by distance. The sound of a horse's hooves or a wagon's wheel would vanish almost instantly, swallowed by the open air. On nights when the moon hung low and full, the fields glowed faintly, not white, not silver, but something softer, a quiet luminance that seemed to drift from the ground itself. Travelers swore that the light changed as they moved, that shadows rippled and shapes shifted in the tall grass. Some said it was the wind, others claimed that the land was dreaming, its surface alive with old memory. To look too long at the plains under moonlight was to feel disoriented, as though the horizon were breathing in and out. The wind was constant, a low, ceaseless murmur that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. It passed through the grass with a sound like whispering water, turning the whole plain into one vast, restless motion. When it died, the silence that followed felt heavier than before, thick and almost physical. Men riding across that silence sometimes felt their hearts quicken, not out of fear, but because the absence of sound was so complete, it felt unnatural. The land, though open, carried a sense of confinement, a boundary made not by walls but by infinity. Few trees broke the horizon, and those that did stood like lonely survivors, cottonwoods and elms bent under the wind, their branches sighing. At night, their shadows stretched endlessly across the grass, blurring into each other until the world seemed to have no edges. Travelers often camped near them for comfort, but even there the vastness pressed close. The wind found its way through every branch and every seam in a tent, whispering in long, irregular breaths. It was easy to believe in such places that the plains were alive in some patient, unknowable way. The soil was rich but ancient, layered with the remains of thousands of years, grass upon grass, season upon season. Beneath it lay fossils, bones, fragments of worlds that had come before. The settlers did not know these details, but they felt them. The land seemed to hold too much memory to be merely earth. In the moonlight it shimmered faintly, as though the surface were thin and something vast stirred beneath. Some of the early travelers through Kansas and Nebraska wrote of seeing lights, soft flickering glows that moved across the horizon like lanterns. They appeared and vanished without pattern, sometimes near, sometimes impossibly far. Explanations were attempted: fireflies, distant camps, reflections of starlight on the river. Yet the reports persisted. Men spoke of feeling watched, though there was nothing to see but grass and sky. Their horses would stop and snort, staring at nothing, their ears twitching toward sounds no human could hear. To sleep on the open plains was to surrender to immensity. The ground radiated the day's heat, the air carrying a faint scent of dry grass and dust. The stars arched so high above that the sky itself seemed curved inward, like the inside of a vast inverted bowl. Travelers often described a sensation of falling upward when they lay back to rest, a strange dizziness that came from the sheer scale of it all. The moon traced its slow path, silvering the grass, illuminating nothing but the endless repetition of distance. The people who crossed the plains began to measure time differently. A day was not counted in hours, but in horizons. A mile meant less than a shadow's length, and the moon, which rose and fell like a tide, became their only clock. The monotony was both soothing and unsettling. Some found peace in it, the rhythm of the wind, the steady sway of grass, the hum of insects that rose and fell like breathing. Others felt something close to madness, the sense that the land, by its sheer indifference, was slowly erasing them. When storms came, they did so with no warning. The air would shift, the light would flatten, clouds would gather so high they seemed to descend from the stars themselves. Lightning would ripple silently across the sky before the thunder arrived, long, rolling waves that broke the stillness with startling force. Then, as suddenly as they came, the storms would pass, leaving behind a strange clarity, the air smelling faintly of iron and rain. Those who survived the crossings carried the plains within them afterward. Even years later, settled in towns with walls and streets, they would speak of dreams in which the grass moved endlessly, whispering beneath a pale moon. They would wake with the sound of the wind still in their ears, unsure whether it had been real or remembered. The plains were not a place that let go easily. They had a way of lingering, in thought, in silence, in the long pauses between words. And always, the moon returned, round, pale, and slow. It climbed the sky, and looked down upon the motionless sea of grass, watching it breathe, watching it dream. The wind moved once more, and the plains shivered gently, as though something vast and ancient had stirred in its sleep. Long before the settlers, indigenous nations lived with the rhythm of the nocturnal world. They knew where the stars rose, where the spirits were said to walk, and how silence could speak when listened to properly. To them the land was not wilderness, nor empty. It was alive, aware, and continuous. Every shadow had a purpose, every sound a lineage. The rivers that now carried traders and wagons had once been lines of memory, their currents connecting villages, stories, and the slow turning of seasons. In those centuries before fences or maps, the land and its people moved together. Nights were not feared, they were known. The constellations served not only for navigation but for storytelling, the sky itself, a living archive of memory. Each star carried a tale of hunts and spirits, of creation and return. The moon was not a light to banish darkness, but a companion that watched and recorded, its shifting phases marking time, in a way that felt closer to breathing than to counting. The people who lived along the plains and rivers of the interior, the Lakota, Pawnee, Osage, and countless others, built their lives around listening. In their languages, silence was not emptiness, but depth. The call of a night bird, the crack of distant ice, the faint rush of wind across the prairie, all carried meaning. To move through the dark was not to be lost, but to be guided. The world spoke, softly and endlessly, to those who knew how to hear it. The rivers, too, were part of that voice. They sang differently in summer than in winter, their currents changing pitch as the water deepened or froze. Many believed the rivers remembered, that their sound carried the weight of everything that had touched them. Fishermen and travelers would pause to listen before crossing, waiting for the right tone, the right breath of current that signaled safety. Some nights, when fog hung low and the moonlight turned the water silver, they said the river's voice shifted, slower, lower, as if something vast was moving beneath the surface. These were the nights when offerings were left, tobacco, carved stones, whispered words meant to keep the balance between what was seen and what was not. The plains at night were a different world. Fires were small, more for ceremony than for warmth. Songs rose and fell in the dark, carried on the wind, until they merged with the murmur of grass and insects. To an outsider, the sounds might have seemed random, but to those who knew, they formed a language older than speech, a conversation between the living and the unseen. Some tribes spoke of spirits who traveled only under the light of the moon, drawn to places where the earth was open and the stars reflected on water. Others believed that dreams walked with the wind, drifting between sleepers like invisible travelers seeking a place to rest. This understanding of night was not superstition, it was coexistence. Where the settlers feared what could not be lit, the First Nations moved through it with respect. Darkness did not hide, it revealed. The boundaries between human and land, between spirit and breath, grew softer under the stars. Even fear had a purpose. It was a reminder that one existed within something larger, something awake. But when the newcomers arrived, first the explorers, then the traders, then the endless line of settlers, the rhythm of the night began to change. The fires grew larger, the silence shorter. The old songs no longer carried across the water, drowned by the sound of wagons and hammers. The rivers, once pathways of reflection and offering, became routes of passage and possession. Their songs deepened, weighted, now with silt, with the voices of the displaced. The indigenous nations watched as the land they knew began to alter its sound. The birds moved differently, the animals changed their paths. Forests that had stood for generations fell in a single season. Smoke drifted where mist once rose. The balance of listening and speaking tilted. The land was no longer being heard, it was being used. Yet, even in silence, its memory endured. The wind still carried fragments of those older songs, the rivers still murmured in their sleep, and on certain nights, when the air was still and the moon full, one could almost hear the old rhythm, faint, distant but alive. To this day, the plains and rivers hold that dual memory of a world once shared in quiet understanding and of a world broken open by noise. The land remembers both. It dreams still in moonlight, though its dreams are heavier now, layered with echoes. Somewhere beneath the sound of modern roads and engines, beneath the hum of civilization, there remains a faint undertone, the ancient pulse of rivers that once sang freely to those who knew how to listen. The settlers would later write of those same waters as guides or obstacles, never realizing they were crossing through something sacred, something still awake. The rivers continued to flow, patient and indifferent, carrying with them all that had been lost, all that remained unspoken. Their songs changed, but never silenced. Trading posts and forts lit up the darkness, yet the surrounding wilds never settled. Coyotes laughed from invisible distances. Fires crackled as if the air itself were restless. The frontier, by the mid-1800s, had begun to glow faintly at night. Small lanterns strung along the edges of nowhere, a constellation of human persistence pushing against the black horizon. From Missouri to the Dakota Plains, from the Arkansas River to the edge of the Rockies, faint points of light dotted the map like hesitant thoughts. These were the forts, the way stations, the wooden squares built from necessity rather than confidence. They were meant to hold back the unknown, though everyone who lived inside them understood, quietly, that the unknown did not care. Inside, the nights were long, soldiers and traders huddled in rooms, smelling of tallow and damp leather, listening to the wind press itself against the walls. The timbers creaked, as if remembering the forests they had once been. Outside, wolves and coyotes answered each other in long, unbroken tones that carried across the snow. Horses shifted uneasily in their pens, hooves thudding dully against the packed earth. Somewhere out in the vastness, the rivers still moved, their surfaces glazed in thin ice that cracked under the weight of the moonlight. Men wrote letters that never reached their destinations. They described the quiet as something physical, a presence that entered the lungs, that filled the skull until thoughts became slow, circular things. Some spoke of the way the stars seemed too close, too large. They hung above the plains, like eyes that never blinked. The sky itself, stripped of the haze of cities, revealed too much. Every light above was a reminder of how small the lantern fires below truly were. The trading posts brought a thin comfort, the illusion of civilization clinging to the edge of wilderness. Fur trappers arrived in silence, their faces cracked by cold, their eyes hollow from months of solitude. They traded pelts for tobacco, powder, and tin. Sometimes they spoke of distant valleys where no wind blew, or of lakes that steamed even in winter. But such tales drifted quickly into the air and were replaced by the practical murmur of commerce. The night, always listening, took them back. By day, the frontier appeared manageable. Smoke rose from chimneys, wagons rolled along the trails, and the flags of distant forts snapped in the wind. But after sunset, the landscape reclaimed its dominion. The prairies expanded again, swallowing the faint signs of order. The world flattened into one endless tone, the hush of grass, the whisper of frozen soil, the slow shifting of unseen things. There was no true silence here, even the stillness made sound. Many who lived on the edge began to sense a pattern, that the nights had moods. Some were gentle, their winds soft, their stars calm. Others arrived heavy, electric, charged with something unspoken. On those nights, dogs refused to settle, fires burned strangely, their flames bending against unseen drafts. The air seemed to listen. A single cough could echo through the darkness for impossible distances. When the first storms came, rolling across the plains without warning, lightning illuminated not only the horizon, but the faces of men awake long after they wished to sleep. There are written accounts, brief, matter-of-fact, of men vanishing between posts, of scouts whose trails ended cleanly, as if the earth had closed over them. Official reports blamed snow, wind, exhaustion. Yet among those who stayed behind, whispers moved through the barracks, that the frontier itself was not empty, only waiting, that there were places where compasses turned uncertain, where sound behaved as if it remembered older voices. Forts such as Laramie, Bent's Old Fort, and Fort Union were more than trading hubs. They were experiments in endurance, built from mud brick, timber, and stone. Their walls absorbed the cold and returned it at night. Inside the thick silence, a man could hear the ticking of his own heartbeat. Guards pacing the parapets wrote of footsteps that seemed to echo out of sync, as if someone else walked the same path just beyond the corner of sight. The historian Francis Parkman, who travelled through the plains in 1846, described nights when the whole wilderness seemed listening, a phrase that others repeated, each in their own journals, as though compelled by the same awareness. The native nations watched these outposts with quiet understanding. To them, the settlers were building homes in a land that had not agreed to hold them. The lights of the forts were temporary stars, burning too bright, destined to fade. The Lakota and Cheyenne spoke of balance, of how certain places were not meant for sleep, where spirits moved freely, or where the earth's energy was restless. To build there was to invite unease, not through superstition, but through simple disregard for what already was. And yet, the posts endured, at least for a time. Trade continued. Treaties were written, broken, rewritten again. The edges of the map pushed farther west. Still, each new fort faced the same insomnia. Nights filled with shifting sounds, the drumming of wind against canvas, the soft cry of distant wildlife, the rustle of the unseen. Men kept fires burning longer than needed, not out of cold but out of fear that the darkness itself might press closer if they didn't. The frontier refused to sleep, because the land had never been still. Beneath the grass, insects hummed, roots shifted, water moved unseen through the soil. Above, stars turned endlessly in silence, their light falling across miles of untouched plain. Between these two vast motions, the slow pulse of the earth and the endless drift of the sky, humans existed as brief interruptions, fragile sparks within an older rhythm. The frontier tolerated them, but never accepted them, and when dawn finally came, pale and reluctant, it did not bring relief, only the faint realization that the wilderness had been watching all along. In old diaries, loneliness seeps through every word, stories of endless horizons, of creaking wood at night, of the way the prairie wind carried voices that didn't belong to anyone. The frontier left few witnesses, and even fewer written records that survived the slow erasure of time. But among those that remain, fragile pages now browned with age, their ink fading to the color of rust, one can still feel the breath of the nights they describe. Letters written by candlelight, by men and women who had no one nearby to speak to, became both confession and company. They were written slowly, their sentences drawn out like the long stretches of road between settlements. The handwriting trembled not from fear, but from cold and fatigue. Wax dripped in uneven circles. The letters smell, even now, faintly of smoke and tallow. They were folded carefully, sealed with wax, and often never sent. Sometimes they were left in drawers, beneath floorboards, in trunks never reclaimed, a private record of those who tried to speak into the silence, and found the silence speaking back. The language of these letters was unhurried. The writers often began by describing the weather, how the wind sounded different that night, or how frost had crept inside the window frame. They wrote of isolation as if it were a kind of weather too, something that arrived in waves, settled in corners, and could not be shaken off. Many described the way the horizon looked at dusk, a single unbroken line dividing the world into two unknowable halves, the sky above, infinite and pale, the land below, endless and mute. Women on the frontier often wrote of the quiet between chores, how the spinning wheel seemed to echo too loudly, or how the ticking of a clock grew unbearable in rooms, meant for laughter that never came. They wrote to husbands far away, to families back east, to children who might one day read their words. One diary from Nebraska, dated 1858, records, "It is strange to miss even the sound of another's breathing. When I lie awake, the wind against the walls becomes a kind of heartbeat, though not my own." Another from the Dakota Territory tells of a woman who kept a lamp burning through every night of winter, not for light, but for companionship. "The small flame," she wrote, "makes me feel that someone somewhere might see it and know I am still here." Men wrote differently. Their letters were pragmatic at first. reports of crops, distances, trade and tools. Yet between the lines, the same ache emerges. They mention hearing footsteps when none were there, or voices carried over the plains that faded as soon as they tried to answer. Some wondered if the sound was their own memory returning to them, an echo of a home they had forgotten how to find. Explorers and surveyors, often alone for weeks, wrote of the sky as a presence, heavy, low, watching. At night, they described how the stars seemed to pulse, how the air itself hummed faintly when the wind died. They used the word alive, not in wonder, but in resignation. The land, they decided, was aware of them, and that awareness was not always welcome. In one surviving journal from Fort Benton, a fur trader notes, "I have been awake 3 nights, and cannot say if it is fear, or only the sound of the wind that keeps me so. I sometimes think the prairie itself breathes, and that we live not upon it, but within it." He died a month later, though the entry gives no clue how. These writings reveal something rare, the way the human mind stretches and frays when left too long in vast silence. The frontier was not filled with constant struggle or violence as stories later imagined. It was filled with waiting, waiting for dawn, for mail, for thaw, for a voice to answer back. The settlers' greatest enemy was not the wilderness, it was the empty space between sounds. The candles they used were often made from animal fat, smoky and short-lived. The flame flickered wildly, distorting shadows on the walls. Writers would pause, letting the light settle before continuing their sentences. That flicker, that tiny pulse of movement, became something they watched for comfort. It was proof of life, a reminder that time was still passing even when days felt suspended. There's a haunting similarity between these letters, no matter where they came from. Texas, Montana, the Great Plains, the Oregon Trail. The same words appear again and again. Quiet, endless, alone, watching. One might imagine these voices speaking to one another across centuries, describing the same night, the same wind, the same fear that the land would forget them before history remembered them. Many letters never reached their intended recipients because there was no one left to receive them. When wagons broke down, when small settlements vanished under blizzards or drought, their belongings were often gathered by others. Sometimes the letters were burned for warmth. Sometimes they were simply left behind, their words joining the dust. But a few survived, passed through families, stored in attics, eventually arriving in archives. Today, historians read them in quiet rooms under fluorescent light, hearing, faintly, the echo of those restless nights. Even the letters that were delivered carried a strange tone, a calm resignation that feels unlike any modern correspondence. They speak from a place of distance so vast that language itself becomes fragile. The words are not only meant for others, they are meant for the writer's own survival. To write was to remind oneself that time still flowed forward, that someone somewhere might one day understand. When the candles burned low, the writers often ended their letters abruptly, a sentence cut off mid-thought, a blot of ink, sometimes just a single line like, "The wind has changed." It's impossible to know whether that meant dawn was coming, or if something else had shifted, something within them. Modern historians can measure the years and events of the frontier with precision, the dates of treaties, the boundaries of territories, the routes of railroads. But what these letters reveal is something quieter, something unmeasured, the psychology of solitude, the weight of distance that no map could reduce, the slow disintegration of self beneath a sky too vast to comprehend. They are history's whispers, words written not to be read, but to be kept from disappearing. And when one reads them now, in libraries where silence hums with electricity instead of wind, it is impossible not to feel that same faint presence, the hush of candlelight, the sound of a pen scratching across paper while the rest of the world sleeps. When fog rolled across the plains, even the stars seemed lost. Travelers woke unsure of where they had camped, certain that the land had quietly shifted while they slept. There were nights when the American frontier ceased to have edges, when its familiar distances dissolved, and the earth itself appeared to drift. Fog would rise from the low valleys and riverbeds, spreading slowly over the prairie like something alive, swallowing the known world one blade of grass at a time. Men who had spent years mapping the land, measuring it, memorizing its contours, woke to find that none of it remained the same. Hills had vanished, rivers had changed their sound, and trails that had been straight for miles bent strangely underfoot. In those early hours before dawn, the frontier was neither land nor sky, just a grey ocean of movement, where even one's own breath disappeared as soon as it left the mouth. The fog was not merely weather, it was a kind of forgetting. The horizon, that constant companion of every traveller, had vanished, and with it so had the sense of direction that kept men sane. Surveyors travelling westward in the 1840s wrote of waking to find their compasses useless. Needles spun slowly, then stilled, then turned again without pattern. Instruments that had once been the guardians of certainty became decorations for confusion. The journals describe this not as panic, but as quiet bewilderment, a recognition that the vastness of the land was capable of rewriting itself at will. On these fog nights, the world seemed weightless. Sound carried oddly, a cough could echo in several directions at once, and footsteps felt disconnected from the earth. Horses shied at shadows that weren't there, fires burned dull, their light unable to pierce more than a few feet before surrendering to the pale curtain. Even the animals fell silent, as if waiting for the land to remember what shape it was supposed to hold. The fog was heaviest near water. Along the Platte, the Missouri, and the Arkansas rivers, the mist could roll for miles, dense and slow, swallowing entire wagon trains. Some accounts tell of groups separated by only a few yards who could no longer hear each other's voices. They shouted names into the grey, receiving no answer except their own echo. One man described it as standing in the middle of breath. The air itself had texture, damp, thick, uncertain. There were practical explanations, of course. Temperature inversions, humidity, the cooling of wet ground after sunset, the slow machinery of weather working as it always had. But to those living through it, logic meant little. What mattered was the sensation that the land which had once been firm and navigable had turned traitor. A farmer could walk a dozen paces from his cabin and lose sight of it entirely. A scout could wander for hours, guided only by the uneven sound of his own heart. The fog erased the idea of here. Some believed the fog carried memory, that the spirits of those who had died along the trails drifted within it, whispering in tongues that dissolved as soon as they were heard. Others said the fog came when the land itself needed to rest, when it folded inward to heal from the endless cutting of trees and trampling of hooves. A few, more practical but no less uneasy, thought the fog was a form of resistance, a natural defense against human intrusion, blurring what was not meant to be seen. In 1861, a soldier stationed near Fort Randall wrote, "Last night we lost the sky. It was as though God had taken it away. I could not tell if I was standing or floating. The ground felt thin under my boots. We heard water, but there is no river here. The entry ends abruptly." His later notes make no mention of that night again. As dawn approached, the fog did not lift so much as fade, drawn back into the low earth, retreating slowly until the familiar world returned, slightly altered. Trees stood where none had been noticed before. Paths that had led one way now curved another. Those who had tried to mark their position found their bearings reversed. Some swore that their camps had shifted several feet overnight, not the tents or the tools but the land beneath them. In one recorded instance, a wagon train traveling through Kansas lost its lead scouts entirely in the fog. When it cleared, they found the men half a mile behind the rest of the group, walking in circles, convinced they were still moving west. Their footprints, when traced, formed no pattern, just a spiral pressed faintly into the damp ground. For days afterward, travellers spoke of strange after-effects, of how the wind sounded hollow, of how the light seemed slightly dimmer, even at noon. The fog, it seemed, left behind a residue of silence. Birds were slow to return. Coyotes did not call. Fires smoked longer before catching. The air remained still, as if the land were remembering how to hold itself together again. Later generations would speak of these occurrences as exaggeration, the result of fatigue, hunger, isolation, but the reports are too consistent, spread across too many years and too many miles, to dismiss entirely. Something in that vast geography seemed capable of bending perception, erasing certainty, and replacing it with a quieter, older kind of truth, that humans were guests here, and the host did not always wish to be seen. The nights of fog became, in a way, part of the folklore of the plains. Settlers told their children to stay close when the mist came, to keep the lantern high, and never wander from the sound of the fire. They said the land could lose its memory, and when it did, it might forget them too. Today, the prairie still knows fog, though the highways and fences have tamed its reach. But if one drives far enough, beyond the towns and the fields of wheat, there are mornings when it returns as it once did, rising in slow waves, swallowing distance, muting color. In those moments, the horizon vanishes again, and the traveler, for just a heartbeat, feels the same unease, the same fragile wonder that the early wanderers felt when they realized the land was not fixed, but alive. The frontier, on those nights, was not a place, it was a presence, and when it forgot its shape, so did the people who tried to live upon it. Whispered stories began to spread, of riders seen against the moon, of empty roads where boots left no prints, of fires that burned with no camp nearby. Myths took root in the silence. In every place where human presence is thin, imagination begins to fill the gaps. On the American frontier, where distance itself seemed to have no end, those gaps were endless. The plains, the forests, and the canyons carried not just wind and dust, but rumor, and rumor, when left alone under vast skies, becomes something more enduring. It began quietly. A trader at Bent's Fort mentioned a rider who had passed through his vision one night, a dark figure on a pale horse, moving without sound across the open plain. He assumed it was a reflection of the moon, or perhaps exhaustion. But when he told the story the next day, another man claimed to have seen the same. Then another, 100 miles away, recorded something similar in his journal. The details differed, but the shape of the tale remained. Something moved in the night, not hostile, not visible for long, but undeniably there. The Phantom Frontier, as it came to be called in later folklore, was less a collection of ghost stories than a collective mood. It grew from the unending quiet, from the exhaustion of distance, from the long stretches of time when men had only their thoughts for company. The land, so old and indifferent, became a mirror for the human mind, and what the mind projected into it took on a life of its own. By the mid-1800s, such stories had become common enough to earn their own rhythm. Soldiers stationed along the frontier wrote of hearing hoofbeats at night when no patrols were out. Trappers spoke of fires glowing on the far ridges, which vanished as soon as they approached. Wagon trains traveling west through Nebraska told of voices on the wind, indistinct murmurs that seemed to follow the moving wheels. They spoke softly, without malice, as though carrying on a conversation from another time. No one called these events supernatural. The word had not yet taken root in that sense. They were simply noted, small, factual, recorded in journals beside mundane lines about weather and supplies. Saw a light near the hills after sundown, one man wrote. No one was there when we went to look. Another noted, heard footsteps near camp again, though ground was dry and showed nothing come morning. If one reads enough of these accounts, a pattern emerges. The events always occur in stillness, on windless nights, under heavy air, when the line between waking and sleep begins to blur. They never bring harm, they leave no proof. They return just often enough to keep men from feeling entirely alone, yet never often enough to confirm belief. The Phantom Frontier did not haunt, it reminded. It was a quiet suggestion that perhaps the land itself was watching, or that it carried echoes of those who had crossed it long before. The geography of these stories followed the geography of expansion, from the Mississippi to the Missouri, from Kansas to the Great Basin. As settlers moved westward, the myths traveled with them. Campfire conversations became a kind of map-making in themselves, the first shared folklore of a continent still half asleep. Each region added its own shapes to the fog: ghost riders in Wyoming, spectral fires in Texas, phantom herds in Montana that thundered across the plains on windless nights. In the high desert, travelers swore that voices carried from stone to stone, as if the mesas themselves repeated forgotten names. In the forests of Oregon, loggers heard axes echo long after work had ceased, and found fresh chips in trees they hadn't touched. These accounts were rarely shouted or celebrated. They were muttered, shared in the slow way that facts become truths. It's easy to dismiss such tales as fear or fatigue, but there was something deeper beneath them. These stories formed a language for describing what could not otherwise be explained. The feeling that the wilderness, vast and ancient, was not merely background but participant. That something older than settlement still lived in the soil and sky, unwilling to yield fully to the order being imposed upon it. Even official documents contain traces of this mood. In one report from 1867, a military engineer described a stretch of land near the Platte River where the air, he wrote, feels wrong to the lungs. Another, from a post near Fort Union, notes, "Men say they hear talking outside the stockade at night. I believe it is the wind, but the sound carries words." He concludes, somewhat uncertainly, "It is easier not to listen." There were fires too. Small points of light seen from great distances, burning steady in places no one had reason to be. The light was never bright, never wild, just steady enough to be mistaken for a signal. Men followed it and found nothing. Some said it was swamp gas, others said it was miners or bandits, but as the years passed, the lights continued to appear, sometimes in the same places long after any camps had vanished. They became known simply as the Watchers. By the 1870s, the phantom frontier had taken root in folklore. Newspapers from Kansas to Colorado printed columns about mysterious riders and wandering fires. Travelers began to leave offerings, small coins, bits of cloth, charms, at lonely crossroads, a quiet tradition meant to keep the night calm. Those gestures were less about belief than about respect, an unspoken understanding that the land remembered more than it revealed. Even today, the landscapes where those stories began have not lost their stillness. The prairie at night still carries that faint hum, that low vibration of wind and earth that sounds almost like breath. Modern travelers driving through the heartland sometimes report seeing movement along the ridgelines, a flicker of light, a dark shape keeping pace with the road before vanishing into open air. They dismiss it as tricks of vision, headlights refracted in dust, shadows from their own passing. And yet, when the night deepens and the road stretches unbroken in both directions, the feeling returns, that same sensation the settlers once described in ink and candlelight, the quiet conviction that they are not as alone as they seem. The phantom frontier was never about ghosts. It was about memory, the memory of footsteps that once pressed the soil, of fires long extinguished, of dreams carried by those who slept under skies too vast for comfort. It was the mind's way of acknowledging what the heart already knew, that no land this old could ever truly be empty. And so the stories lingered, told softly beside fires that hissed against the wind, passed through generations not as warnings, but as lullabies, reminders that the wilderness was still awake, still listening, still dreaming in the space between footsteps. The frontier may have been conquered, mapped, and fenced, but its silence remains untamed. And in that silence, if one listens closely, the old myths still breathe. Wagons creaked across endless ground, leaving deep tracks that filled with moonlight. The night along the trails was said to hum, the kind of hum you feel more than hear. The westward road was never a single path. It was a collection of trails, faint and shifting, each one following the faint memory of another. The Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe, the Mormon, the California, their names would one day become solid in history books, drawn in confident lines on maps. But in those early decades, they were little more than ideas in dust. They stretched across a continent that had not yet decided what it was willing to reveal. To travel west was to enter a moving silence. The clatter of wheels and the groan of wood filled the day, but at night, when the fires burned low and the animals rested, That silence grew so deep it almost seemed alive. Settlers wrote that it pressed against them, a soft, breathing presence. Some described it as peace. Others said it felt like the land itself was listening. The first great wave of westward migration began in the 1840s, when the promise of open land and gold began to draw families and wanderers across the Mississippi. The wagons were slow, their wheels bound with iron, their canvas tops glowing faintly under the stars. They moved not in solitude but in long lines. Hundreds of travelers stretched across the horizon, following the same faint ruts carved by those who had gone before. And yet, even in those crowds, loneliness clung like dust. At night, when the air cooled and the prairie grasses swayed in one long whispering wave, the travelers spoke softly, not from fear but reverence. The open land made voices sound small. The stars, vast and steady, seemed almost close enough to touch, but the darkness between them felt endless. The road, which seemed solid under daylight, became unsteady beneath the moon. There are countless journals from those nights, ordinary entries almost too calm to carry meaning, yet within them lies the faint pulse of something larger. The moon was high, one woman wrote in her diary near Fort Laramie, and the grass moved like water. The wheels made no sound. It seemed as if we floated. Another, crossing near the Platte, noted simply, "The night hummed again. The men do not speak of it, but they hear it too." The hum she mentioned appears in dozens of similar writings. It was never clearly described, not a wind, not an insect's buzz, but a low vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Some believed it was the sound of the soil cooling after the day's heat. Others thought it was the wind trapped in the grasses. A few claimed it was nothing natural, that it followed them, that it grew louder when they camped where others had died. Whatever it was, it became a part of the westward myth. People said the hum marked the old trails, that it was the sound of the land remembering every step, every wheel, every lost voice. During the long months of travel, the world took on strange proportions. Time stretched thin, marked only by the changing light. Days blurred together, and nights seemed longer than they should be. Travelers began to lose their sense of distance. They spoke of walking for hours without moving, of waking to find themselves miles farther than they remembered. The land, vast and indifferent, swallowed such errors without question. Some diaries mention lights, faint glows that appeared far from the wagons and moved slowly across the plains. They could have been campfires, reflections, or tricks of exhaustion, but the travelers gave them meaning. They called them guides, believing they belonged to those who had gone ahead. The lights always kept a distance, neither near enough to warm the air, nor far enough to ignore. They moved with the pace of travelers, as though marking the way forward. The more poetic among them thought of the land as breathing, inhaling when the winds rose, exhaling when the night fell still. When the wind passed through the tall grass, it carried a sound that resembled whispering voices. Some nights the voices seemed to come from behind, as though the plains themselves were speaking in the language of footsteps already taken. And there were the animals, oxen standing silent, eyes reflecting the moon, horses restless for reasons no one could see. Coyotes barked from the dark, their calls rising in perfect intervals, as if mimicking human speech. Wolves followed from a distance, never close, but always visible in the edge of firelight. Two eyes, waiting for something only they seemed to know. The westward journey was as much about endurance as it was about faith. Faith in direction, in survival, in the idea that the land ahead would be kinder than the land behind. Each night, travelers knelt beside the dying fire, listening to the strange hum of the earth. The sound had no melody, yet it seemed to carry memory of all who had crossed before and all who had fallen along the way. By the time dawn came, the hum would fade, the air cooled, and the land grew still again, as though nothing had happened. The travelers would rise, dust off their boots, and move on. But in the journals, the pattern repeats. The hum returned, heard it again last night. Can't sleep, the ground is not quiet. Historians have debated for years what this phenomenon could have been. Some suggest the wind sweeping through millions of blades of prairie grass, producing a natural drone. Others believe it was psychological, the combined result of fatigue, hunger, and isolation. Yet those explanations, however rational, fail to account for how universal the experience was. The hum was heard by those who traveled alone, and by those in great caravans. It was recorded by soldiers, missionaries, women and children, people with no reason to invent the same strange detail. And always, it appeared when the wagons stopped, when conversation died, when the prairie stretched wide and bare beneath a pale moon. The westward trails were littered with remnants, broken wheels, discarded trunks, small grave markers, carved from whatever wood could be found. The road itself became a kind of memory, a record of motion written into the soil. Long after the travelers were gone, those grooves remained, visible in the moonlight, like faint scars across the land. Even now, some of them can still be seen from the air, thin pale lines running through the grass, marking where the wheels once pressed. Standing there today, under the same wide sky, one can almost imagine that hum still lingering, a sound too low for the ear, but still present beneath the feet. A sound made, not by nature, but by memory. The road westward never truly ended. It continued in the mind, in the quiet hours when the body rests but the thoughts keep walking. To move west was to walk through both time and space, to listen as the earth shifted beneath human ambition. The road was not cursed, though it carried its share of sorrow. It was simply awake, and in its wakefulness, it hummed softly to those who dared to cross it. A lullaby for the restless, a song of distance for the sleepless traveler. Mining camps that sprang up overnight disappeared just as quickly. Some were left standing, stores full, chairs pulled out, coffee cups still on tables, as if everyone had simply stepped outside and never returned. Across the American frontier, towns were born not from planning, but from whispers, a rumor of gold in a riverbed, a vein of silver glimpsed in a canyon wall, a trader's tale told too convincingly in a tavern. That was all it took. Within days, tents and shacks appeared like mushrooms after rain. Paths were worn into the dust, wells were dug, and crude signs were nailed to rough-hewn boards. Store, saloon, barber, claims office. For a while the air would hum with motion, picks striking stone, horses stamping against their ropes, men shouting, laughing, cursing, all chasing the same shimmering promise that something valuable lay hidden just beneath their feet. But the sound never lasted long. The same wind that carried news of discovery, carried news of failure, and as suddenly as they had formed, the towns emptied. The strange thing, though, is that some of them emptied without warning. Travelers who came through the mountain passes of Nevada or Colorado told of finding whole settlements abandoned, tables still set, lanterns half full of oil, beds unmade but still warm with the memory of use. In the high deserts of Utah, surveyors in the 1870s reported walking through towns so intact, it was as if the people had only stepped outside to watch something happening beyond the horizon. They called them blink towns, places that appeared in one season and were gone by the next, not collapsed, not destroyed, simply left behind. One of the most famous was a settlement called Cerro Gordo, perched on a ridge of the Inyo Mountains overlooking Owens Valley. In 1869, it was one of the richest silver mines in California. At night, its lamps glittered like a second constellation over the desert floor. Then, one winter morning, travelers arriving from the valley below found the town silent. The mine shafts were empty, the houses unlocked, a pot still sat on the stove, the stew inside hardened to stone. There were no bodies, no signs of struggle. The snow around the town was unbroken. Of course, historians later explained the mystery. The miners had left in the night after the ore ran out, following a new rumor farther east. Yet even with explanation, something about Cerro Gordo lingered in the imagination. The image of a town vanishing between dusk and dawn was too powerful to dismiss. Farther north, In Montana and Idaho, the same stories repeated. The gold rush brought thousands into the mountains and took them away again, often without a word. Camps with names like Bannack, Garnet, and Elkhorn saw populations rise and fall with the rhythm of the earth itself. One month, 2,000 people might live there, the next, barely a dozen. Those who stayed wrote of the strange silence that followed. You could hear the snow fall, one prospector wrote, and feel the air remembering laughter that wasn't there. The frontier had a way of erasing its own history in real time. Without stone or permanence, the towns dissolved back into dust. Yet sometimes the traces remained, half-buried bottles, rusted pans, the frame of a door that no longer led anywhere. There were also the towns no one could quite locate. Names appeared in letters and newspapers: Providence, Silver Grove, Dry Creek Camp. But when later surveyors searched for them, there was nothing. No remains, no coordinates, not even the memory of a trail. It was as if the names had belonged to dreams. Travelers spoke of riding into a valley and seeing the lights of a camp glowing faintly ahead, only to find, when they arrived, that the lights had vanished. Some said it was the refraction of starlight through cold air. Others believed the desert itself produced illusions, born of exhaustion and silence. But in old mining folklore, such towns were said to walk. They appeared when the earth was restless and moved when it slept. The phenomenon wasn't limited to the mines. In Kansas, entire farming settlements disappeared during drought years. Homes were left standing, fields still furrowed, windmills creaking over empty wells. A passing traveler might see laundry frozen mid-flutter on a line, or a chair rocking gently on a porch with no wind to move it. Letters found years later suggested that families had left quickly, often at night, chasing water or following rumors of rain. Yet the way they left, leaving so much behind, gave their absence an almost deliberate quality, as if something unseen had hurried them along. The frontier was, in many ways, a living experiment in impermanence. Towns rose and fell faster than the maps could record them. By the time a cartographer drew a new settlement, it might already be gone. Census takers recorded names of communities that ceased to exist before the ink dried. Even the U.S. Post Office, which tried to keep pace with the tide of expansion, found itself delivering mail to towns that had already faded back into sage and dust. In that endless shifting, stories began to form, not of gold or glory, but of the night itself. The miners called it the silence turn. They said that in some places, near certain ridges or under certain moons, a sound would sweep through the camp, not a voice, not a hum, but a vibration that emptied the air. Afterward, men would look around and decide, wordlessly, that it was time to move on. Years later, explorers and photographers who stumbled upon these abandoned sites found the silence unchanged. A coffee cup still on the counter, a boot by the door, a journal half filled, ending mid-sentence. It seemed impossible that human life could be so quickly erased, and yet so gently preserved. Some of those places still exist: Body in California, Rhyolite in Nevada, Bannack in Montana. They have been frozen in time by dry air and distance, their wooden frames bleached by sun and moon. Visitors who walk through them today describe an overwhelming quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint sound of the wind threading through broken glass. They are museums of absence. Each object a relic of departure. A table with cards still scattered across it. A bed with sheets undisturbed. A piano with no song left to give. In sleep, history feels like this. Not gone, just paused. The towns that vanished before morning were not erased by violence or catastrophe. They were erased by time moving faster than the people who lived within it. Their silence is not tragedy. It is continuation. The land simply resumed what it had always been, vast, unhurried, and untouched by the noise of human need. When the moon rises over those forgotten streets, the dust glows silver, and for a moment, it's easy to believe the towns are only resting. that somewhere in the space between dusk and dawn, they still breathe, waiting for the miners, the families, the dreamers to come home again. Markers washed away, wood decayed, and the prairie reclaimed its surface. Travelers sometimes found the ground uneven in strange places, soft underfoot, as though it remembered. The American frontier, for all its motion, left behind countless places where time simply stopped. Not in towns or mines or forts, but in quiet clearings, where someone had been buried without ceremony, their name written once in a diary and never spoken again. The westward expansion, in its enormity, carried not only dreams and wagons and hope, but loss, constant, quiet, and mostly unrecorded. Graves dotted the trails like punctuation marks in a long, unfinished sentence. A wheel would break, a fever would come, a horse would stumble, and the line of movement would pause. There would be a small mound, a few gathered stones, a crude cross if time allowed. Then the wagons would move again, leaving behind only a faint mark in the grass. The prairie wastes no time on remembrance. The wind is its archivist. It smooths every shape, levels every mound, scatters every letter carved into wood. Within a season, the trail dust would settle, and the grave would become part of the land again. A small rise, perhaps, or a patch where the grass grew differently. And yet, even erased, they lingered. Travelers who followed those same routes decades later sometimes reported strange sensations. The ground, they said, would change beneath their boots. One moment it was firm, the next it yielded slightly, as though the earth had softened for a breath. Some said they felt warmth underfoot, a faint pulse. Others spoke of hearing something, not voices, but a tone, low and almost felt rather than heard, rising from the ground itself. In 1852, along a stretch of the Oregon Trail near South Pass, a surveyor named Henry Wills recorded finding a hollow ground that gave way under the step, though it was firm soil. When he and his men dug, they found nothing but sand and a few fragments of wood, perhaps the remains of a coffin, perhaps not. He wrote no more about it, only noting, the air was still, and the place had a hush upon it that stayed with me the rest of the night. These forgotten graves were never meant to be permanent. Most were made of pine or cedar, whatever wood the travelers could spare. Crosses were carved hastily, often with just initials, or not at all. Others used stones stacked in rough circles, or pressed a handprint into wet soil before leaving. Each gesture, small and personal, was an attempt to resist the vastness that surrounded them. In time, the wood would crack, the stones would scatter, and the handprint would fade. But something invisible remained. Along the Platte River, early settlers told of nights when the ground glowed faintly, a soft silver shimmer that drifted just above the soil. Scientists later explained it as the reflection of starlight on dew, but travelers swore it appeared only in certain places where graves had once been marked. They called it the field's breath. Children born along the trail grew up hearing such stories, that the earth remembered those who had fallen into it, and that the hum of the plains was their murmuring. Mothers, soothing children to sleep beside wagon fires, would speak softly of the ones who had walked before, who now lay beneath. They weren't ghosts in the frightening sense, but presences, reminders that the land carried memory the way rivers carry light. Even when the Great Migration ended, and railroads cut through the wilderness, workers continued to uncover bones, sometimes whole skeletons wrapped in faded cloth, sometimes fragments of shoes or buttons. There was rarely any way to identify them. They were reburied quietly, the rails laid over them, the trains passing in steady rhythm above. By the 1880s, entire cemeteries from early settlements had disappeared, wooden markers rotted, storms swept away what little was left. In Kansas, local farmers plowing new fields unearthed dozens of graves that had been forgotten for generations. In Wyoming, a rancher found a cross buried so deep that even its inscription had dissolved, leaving only faint grooves where words once were. The land does not keep secrets cruelly, it keeps them completely. The prairie's silence is not an absence but a fullness, a holding of all things that have passed across it. Every gust of wind, every shadow on the grass, every uneven rise of earth might contain a trace of someone who came west and did not go farther. There are still places, open plains, wooded ridges, dry riverbeds, where the air feels heavy for no reason. Campers who sleep in those places speak of dreaming of footsteps, of shapes moving slowly through fog, of hearing faint laughter or song. They wake to find the world exactly as it was, unchanged and unthreatening, and yet the feeling lingers that the ground beneath them remembers something that they do not. Historians estimate that between 20,000 and 30,000 people died along the major western trails between 1840 and 1870. Disease, accident and exposure claimed more lives than violence ever did, yet only a fraction of those graves were ever recorded. The rest remain anonymous, their stories dissolved into the soil. Over time, as settlements grew and fences crossed the land, people forgot where the graves lay. Towns rose over them, roads were built across them. Some lie now beneath parking lots, others under fields of corn or wheat. And yet, occasionally, the earth gives a quiet reminder, a skull uncovered by rain, a bone fragment turned up by the plough. When such discoveries are made, there is usually a pause. Work stops. Someone kneels, brushes the dirt aside. For a moment, the world grows still again, as if acknowledging the faint continuation of a life that had been silent for over a century. Then the dust covers it once more, and time resumes. In this way, the frontier became its own kind of memorial, not one built of marble or inscription, but of forgetting itself. The act of loss, repeated so often, became a part of the landscape's identity. The prairie doesn't mourn, it endures. And perhaps that's the truest form of remembrance, not in the preservation of names, but in the persistence of silence. The land continues, carrying within it every sound, every breath, every unmarked grave, like a faint vibration in the soil. When the wind moves through the grass on quiet nights, it sounds almost like a sigh. Some say it's the echo of the living, others say it's the forgotten breathing softly beneath. Either way, the sound is gentle, not warning, not grief, just the slow, endless exhale of a land that remembers everything and speaks of nothing. Then came the railroads, black lines through nowhere, their whistles echoing for miles. Some said the sound carried the ghosts of all who died, pushing west. The arrival of iron and steam was meant to tame the land, to carve order into wilderness, to make the map solid. But in the vast spaces of the American frontier, the rails only seemed to stretch the silence thinner. At night, the locomotives cut across the dark like moving sparks. Their headlights glowed faintly against the open plain, a pale cone of light swallowed almost instantly by distance. The whistle, long, low, and mournful, became the new voice of the wilderness. People said it didn't sound mechanical. It sounded alive, like something calling out across centuries. Old settlers used to stop whatever they were doing when they heard it. They'd listen, heads tilted, as the sound drifted and thinned. For many, it was the loneliest sound in the world. Not just a train, but the echo of everything that had come before. Railway workers told stories around their campfires of strange things on the night runs, flickers of lanterns out on the empty plains, where no one could be. Whistles that blew from engines that weren't there, the rhythm of steel wheels clicking over joints in the track, like a slow, ghostly heartbeat. Some said the sound followed them home. In 1873, a conductor named William Hensley wrote in his logbook that during one midnight run through the Wyoming basin, the whistle began to blow by itself. No one was near the lever. The fireman swore he saw movement on the front of the train, a figure standing against the headlamp glare, coat flapping, but when they stopped, no one was there. Hensley never worked another night shift. But the strangeness didn't stop the progress. Railroads spread like veins across the land, pulsing with steam and smoke. Each mile of track marked the end of another piece of silence, but that silence didn't die, it merely hid deeper. The whistle became the sound of both connection and loss. For settlers isolated miles from any town, it was a lifeline, proof that the world was still out there. They'd step out onto their porches just to listen, the distant cry of metal drifting through wind and grass. Some even said the whistle could tell the weather. Low and heavy meant a storm, high and clear meant fair skies. But others heard something else in it, a lament. The sound carried differently at night, bending and echoing in ways that made it seem almost human. Native tribes called it the Iron Cry, believing it to be the land mourning as it was split apart. Even some engineers whispered that the planes seemed to answer, faint vibrations running along the rails long after the train had passed. Travelers lying awake in sleeper cars reported dreams of old trails and abandoned towns, of walking across fields that glowed with starlight. Some woke to find their windows fogged with handprints. When you stood near the tracks after midnight, you could feel the train long before you saw it, the faint tremor in the ground, the metal hum rising beneath your feet. It felt like the pulse of something ancient stirring again. By the 1880s, the whistle had become a kind of myth in itself. Folk songs were written about it, how it could summon the dead, how it could warn of disasters, how its tone changed if the train was doomed to derail. Railroaders swore by it. Townsfolk feared it. And out on the lonely plains where the stars burned cold and close, the sound rolled endlessly on, a reminder that even in progress there are echoes. It was said that the whistle never truly faded. Even after the last train had gone, people could still hear it, faintly somewhere between wind and memory. A single drawn-out note rising from the horizon, mournful and eternal. No one ever proved it. But on still nights, if you stood on old unused tracks long since swallowed by grass, and the moon was high and silver, you might hear it too, a low, distant cry carrying through the dark. And maybe it isn't just steam or wind or memory. Maybe it's the land itself, exhaling the ghosts it has kept for too long. Wires stretched across desolate places, humming faintly. Ranchers heard them at night. Vibrations whispering in empty air, messages that weren't meant for anyone anymore. The telegraph was supposed to make the wilderness smaller. When it arrived, it came in thin, unassuming lines. Strands of wire pulled taut between poles driven deep into indifferent ground. They ran across hundreds of miles of open land, through canyons, over prairies, past lonely stations where one man might listen to the tapping for days on end. With every mile completed, the frontier seemed a little less remote, but in truth the wires carried not just messages, but the strange weight of silence itself. By day, the poles stood like sentinels. By night, they became part of the landscape's uneasy music. The wind would catch on the wires and make them sing, a long, unbroken hum that rose and fell like breath. People said the sound was alive. It wasn't quite human, but not mechanical either. It existed somewhere between. In 1861, when the first transcontinental telegraph line connected the East and West, newspapers celebrated it as the end of isolation. The president in Washington could speak through code and current to California. The dream of connection had finally crossed the continent. But out on the plains, in the still hours before dawn, that same invention took on another life. The sound of the wires became a constant companion to those who lived nearby, faint, melodic, and impossible to ignore. Cattlemen driving herds at night said they could hear the wires moaning above them like an unending voice calling across the land. Some ranchers claimed that even when the wind stopped, the hum remained. It was as if the messages of 1,000 departed hands still clung to the copper. Telegraph operators, those lonely keepers of the frontier's invisible conversations, often spoke of peculiar nights, when the static came alive, when no key was pressed, yet the line trembled with faint, deliberate rhythms. They called it the singing wire. Some blamed weather, others electricity, and some quietly something older, a kind of memory stored in the current. In Kansas, a report from 1878 described a night when every telegraph station along a 200-mile stretch received nonsense signals, rhythmic tapping with no pattern, no origin, no end. Operators wrote it down faithfully, thinking it must be a coded message. But when compared, the sequences didn't match, they never repeated, and the sound stopped the moment the sun rose. There were more stories. A lineman near Cheyenne swore that while repairing a section of wire during a storm, he heard voices, faint, like whispers carried through metal. Not words exactly, but something with intent. When he returned to the station, drenched and shaking, he refused to go out again after dark. Even the native nations, long attuned to the land's hidden tones, began to include the humming wires in their stories. Some said the white man had strung spirits across the plains, trapping voices that once roamed free. Others saw them as pathways for restless souls, invisible trails for the dead who had nowhere left to walk. Over time, those who lived near the lines learned to live with the sound. It became part of the frontier's strange insomnia. On clear nights, when the moon lit the land in silver and the air was cold enough to carry sound for miles, the wires seemed to vibrate with more than just wind. The hum would drift into homes, faint through the walls, a reminder of the unseen network pulsing just beyond sight. People claimed to hear it in their sleep, a low, unbroken drone that seemed to sync with their dreams. When the wind changed, the tone would rise, thin and eerie, like a voice trying to remember its own language. And sometimes, during great storms, when lightning struck the ground and the poles shuddered, the wires would glow faintly, sparks running along their lengths like veins of fire in the dark. Those who witnessed it said the sound that followed wasn't thunder, but something quieter, sadder, as if the sky itself had sighed. As the years went on, the messages grew more routine. Prices of cattle, troop orders, political news, weather reports, the practical language of an expanding world. Yet the hum continued, even when no words were passing through. By the early 1900s, the frontier had begun to disappear. The telegraph poles leaned, the wires loosened, the stations emptied, but the sound, that faint metallic hum, didn't stop. Travelers walking old trails at night sometimes reported hearing it, though the wires were long gone. A vibration in the wind, a tone that seemed to come from nowhere, carrying a rhythm older than the messages it once bore. No one could say what it was. Maybe just memory, replaying itself through the land. Maybe the echo of countless signals, still moving endlessly forward, searching for receivers that no longer exist. Or maybe, as one old rancher told his grandson, it's the world talking to itself. Because when a place has listened for that long, it learns how to speak. And sometimes, if you listen closely enough, it speaks back. Towns grew, saloons filled, but midnight still had its hold. Oil lamps flickered. Music drifted out into the streets and vanished before the horizon, swallowed by distance. The West was supposed to be conquered. By the late 1800s, the telegraph hummed, railroads screamed, and towns began to rise from dust and ambition. Streets were laid, churches built, saloons opened their doors. In the day, everything felt alive with motion. Hammers striking, wagons creaking, voices calling out over markets thick with dust. But when night fell, something older reclaimed the land. No matter how many lamps were lit, darkness pooled in corners. It lingered between buildings, settled across rooftops, stretched wide beyond the edge of town where fences ended and the prairie began. For all the noise of civilization, the silence between those sounds was immense. In places like Dodge City, Abilene, Deadwood, and Virginia City, the nights carried their own strange tension. The saloons stayed bright and noisy until long after midnight. Music from pianos, laughter turned hoarse with whiskey, the shuffle of boots against sawdust-covered floors. Yet when you stepped outside, just beyond the swing doors, it was as if the sound evaporated into the dark. The desert, the plains, the mountains, they swallowed everything. People spoke of it without meaning to. How the stars here felt closer, sharper, How even in a crowd, the night pressed in too near. Oil lamps burned with soft orange halos, their smoke rising to meet the cold. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. Some nights, the light itself seemed fragile, as if struggling to stay alive in air too heavy with stillness. Electricity had not yet arrived in most of these towns. The only constant illumination came from lamps, lanterns, and fire. When the wind swept down from the hills, it extinguished the smaller flames entirely. Travelers would wake in darkness, unsure if it was midnight or dawn. The silence between gusts felt like holding one's breath. By the 1870s, cities like Denver and San Francisco began experimenting with new forms of light, arc lamps that burned with blinding intensity. The press called them artificial suns. They cast harsh shadows across the wooden buildings and streets, a cold blue-white glow that turned faces pale and uneasy. People gathered beneath them at first, fascinated. But after a few nights, complaints spread. The light hummed like insects, it burned the eyes, it made the air itself feel strange. No one wanted to admit it, but the darkness had been easier to live with. Even in growing metropolises like Chicago and St. Louis, the new technology only deepened the sense that the night was something alive, not an absence but a presence that light merely disturbed. There were reports from early electricians who swore that when they powered down a city block after midnight, they could feel the darkness rush back in fast, cold, immediate. It was in these hours between light and its failure that the American night retained its strange hold. In smaller towns, saloon keepers closed their doors but left lanterns burning in their windows. They said it was for safety, for travelers or stagecoaches passing through. But some left them for other reasons. There were stories of buildings that went cold too quickly, of rooms where the air felt thick after midnight, of footsteps heard in empty halls. The frontier might have been tamed by daylight, but the darkness, it seemed, refused to leave. Letters and diaries from the era hint at the same quiet anxiety. A schoolteacher in Nebraska wrote in 1884 that she could not sleep unless a lamp was lit, though she could not say why. A doctor in Arizona described patients who claimed to hear voices when the wind changed, whispers under their windows, never words, just tones. In Montana, an engineer working on early telephone lines reported that the wires made a sound like singing whenever the town's lights went out. People believed in reason, progress, invention, but they also believed in what they felt when the lamps burned low, that the night carried memory, and that progress could only push so far before it woke something old. Even the architecture seemed to betray a quiet unease. Churches built tall steeples not only for faith but for light, lanterns at their peaks, guiding the lost across the plains. City planners widened streets, trying to let the moon reach further in. But the wilderness didn't need to move. It simply waited at the edges, patient and vast. In the mining towns where the nights were deepest, the dark took on a heavier meaning. Coal miners spoke of hearing knocking underground, the echo of their own tools, they said, but softer, slower, and out of rhythm. At night, when they returned to the surface, their faces streaked with soot. Some refused to sleep without windows open. They said the air felt wrong otherwise. The cities were supposed to erase that feeling, to replace the uncertainty of the frontier with the certainty of brick and glass. But even in the heart of progress, the same patterns repeated. People lit their lamps higher. They spoke softly after dark. The whistles of distant trains carried longer than they should have, fading slowly into an invisible horizon. And so, the American night, for all its invention and industry, never truly disappeared. It hid behind the lights, in the quiet hum of telegraph lines, in the sigh of wind between buildings. Every town, no matter how large, kept a small place the dark could still enter, an alley behind the general store, the space beneath a staircase, the empty street at 2 a.m. where only the sound of boots echoed once, and then stopped. The historian Henry Adams, writing at the turn of the century, noted that no light made by man could entirely defeat the dark. It merely reminded it to wait. He was right. Because in the stillness that comes after the last lamp goes out, after the piano stops, after the doors close, the old night breathes again. It doesn't rage, it doesn't threaten, it only listens. And perhaps that is the truest nature of the frontier, not the land, not the gold, not the conquest, but the quiet that survives everything. Paths once full of wagons turned to dust. The air along them felt thicker, heavier, as if memory itself refused to move on. Travelers said their horses grew uneasy there. The great trails of the West, the Oregon, the Santa Fe, the Butterfield Overland, had once carried thousands. They began as ruts in the soil, deepened by wheels and hooves, by the long repetition of migration. Families, traders, soldiers, and dreamers crossed them, leaving behind only the faint trace of movement, iron nails, broken tools, the ash of campfires ground into the dirt. But as the decades passed, the roads fell silent, the rails took their place, the last wagon trains dwindled, and what had once been arteries of motion became still, stretching across empty ground like scars. In the deserts of New Mexico and Utah, those old paths never truly disappeared. Under certain light, just before dusk, their outlines could still be seen, faint depressions running across the sand, too straight to be natural, too worn to be recent. When the wind blew, they filled, only to reappear again after the next storm. Travelers who followed them spoke of a strange pressure in the air, a subtle weight that grew with every mile. Horses shied from those lines, compasses wavered. The wind changed pitch, as if the land itself hummed at some inaudible frequency. Those who camped there overnight often described restless dreams, wagons moving endlessly toward a horizon that never came closer, voices calling through fog, the sound of boots crunching behind them though no one followed. Historians wrote that such sensations were tricks of exhaustion and isolation, but the journals of 19th century surveyors tell another story. Men hardened by war and wilderness still noted an unease they couldn't quite explain. A corporal mapping the old Santa Fe route in 1872 described the sensation of being followed by our own shadows though the moon was not yet up. Another, traveling near the Jornada del Muerto, claimed that at night the sand seemed to breathe, rising and falling as though the earth slept beneath them. The deserts were never truly empty. Indigenous nations had crossed them long before the wagon trails, their paths guided by memory and stars. They warned settlers not to travel at dusk, when, they said, the land changed its face. There were places, they explained, where the ground remembered too much, where the spirits of those who had died along the way still walked. By the time railroads replaced the trails entirely, the desert had begun to reclaim them in earnest. Yucca, sage, and tumbleweed crept back across the worn earth. Rivers shifted, swallowing crossings, yet the faint lines remained, visible from a height, ghostly outlines of where people once believed the world could be crossed by will alone. There are stories, quiet, persistent ones, of travelers who followed those trails even into the 20th century. Prospectors, surveyors, and wanderers drawn by the old names. They all spoke of the same odd calm, the same uneasy stillness. The sound of wind dragging across the sand began to resemble the creak of wagon wheels. The mirages along the horizon sometimes resolved into shapes too clear to dismiss, rows of wagons shimmering in the distance, flickering like heat. One story, recorded by a journalist in 1923, told of a railroad inspector who claimed to see a long column of dust moving parallel to his train across the Mojave. He assumed it was a storm until he realized it kept pace for nearly an hour. When he looked again, the dust had separated into defined shapes, faint and rhythmic, like a caravan moving west. No one else on board saw it. Perhaps it was only wind, heat, and suggestion, but the desert keeps its own kind of history. It does not record in ink or stone, but in rhythm, the way dunes shift and settle, the way silence falls differently depending on who has walked there before. Geologists say the ground along those trails is subtly different, compacted by decades of passage, its texture denser, its sound underfoot lower, as though something deep within remembers being pressed. To walk across it barefoot is to feel the ghost of movement, the faint vibration of absence. Even now, in satellite images, the old wagon routes appear faintly against the sand, parallel lines, looping trails, the fossilized memory of motion. No one uses them, yet they remain visible, defiant against time and erosion. It's as if the land refuses to forget. At night, when the desert cools and the stars emerge in uncountable numbers, the old trails seem to glow faintly in the moonlight. Scientists say it's the reflection of pale minerals, but to those who stand there, the light feels almost alive, a reminder that history, no matter how far buried, still murmurs beneath our feet. And if you stay long enough, in the absolute stillness between one breath of wind and the next, you might hear it too, the creak of invisible wheels, the sigh of canvas in an unseen breeze, the faint cadence of footsteps long since erased, not echoes, exactly, more like memory, refusing to fade. By the late 19th century, much of the wilderness was mapped, fenced and named, yet at night the same unease remained, a stillness that seemed to belong to something older than history. The frontier, once endless and undefined, had finally been folded into the nation's story. Railroads crisscrossed the plains, telegraph wires stitched the distances together, towns stood where grasslands once moved freely beneath the wind. The great rivers had been charted, their bends and tributaries labeled in ink. On paper there was no longer any blank space, but paper is not the same as land. Even as the United States declared the frontier closed in 1890, a quiet persistence lingered in the vastness. Homesteads stood half abandoned, their fences leaning, their windmills turning in circles without sound. Mines were emptied, mills silenced. The land, stripped of its mystery, seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in indifference. Census reports told of progress, of population, of harvests and cattle drives. Yet between those statistics, entire worlds were quietly vanishing. Small towns once built on promise began to shrink as quickly as they had appeared. Their streets, once bright with oil lamps, dimmed again, boards warped, paint peeled. The sounds of laughter and piano faded until the only music left was the wind through gaps in the walls. Visitors who came decades later, surveyors, historians, travelers, spoke of the unsettling quiet that hung over those places. It wasn't simply emptiness. It was the feeling that something remained, watching, a kind of waiting that belonged not to the buildings but to the ground itself. In Kansas, a journalist in 1897 described walking through a deserted settlement where the air itself seemed thick with memory. His boots stirred dust that glittered briefly in the sun before settling back, as though it knew its place. He wrote that the silence was not dead but alive, in a way I could not explain, like a room listening to itself. The same silence spread westward, over the Rockies and into the high deserts. The frontier that men had sought to conquer refused to vanish with them. It merely shed their presence like skin. The trails they carved, the fences they hammered into place, the boundaries they drew, all began to erode beneath the same wind that had been blowing since before their arrival. Nature did not reclaim the land violently. It did so quietly, almost politely. Grass grew over roads. Dust softened sharp corners. Even the graves began to fade. Markers tilted, names worn smooth by rain, until no one could tell who rested beneath them. The earth took everything back, slowly and without struggle. And yet, those who returned to these abandoned regions swore that something human still lingered there. Not ghosts exactly, but impressions. The way the air shifted near a doorway, the faint scent of smoke where no fire burned. In the ruins of old towns, the silence had layers. Step inside a collapsed saloon, and it pressed differently against your skin, heavier, warmer, as though the space remembered being full. Photographers of the early 1900s tried to capture this feeling. Their images, stark, sun-bleached, empty, showed more than decay. They showed balance restored. Buildings looked less like ruins, and more like artifacts of an idea the land had simply outlasted. The frontier was never truly conquered, it merely changed shape. Its spirit retreated inward, into the soil and stone, into the rhythm of seasons that paid no mind to ownership or law. For every acre fenced, another mile of horizon stretched untouched. Even those who celebrated progress sensed it. Writers like Frederick Jackson Turner spoke of the closing of the frontier as the end of American innocence, a transformation from wilderness to civilization. But he also admitted that something ineffable had been lost, an unnamed presence that had shaped the nation's imagination. Out on the plains, that presence never left. At night, the wind still carried the same low moan it always had. Coyotes still called from unseen distances. The stars still hung impossibly far and close at once. The same unease that haunted the first settlers lingered, not as fear, but as awareness. A quiet knowing that the land's history did not end with human footsteps. Old telegraph poles still stood along certain trails, their wires long gone, their wood silvered with age. When the wind moved through them, they made a faint sound, the ghost of connection, a whisper through hollow wood. Locals said that if you stood near one long enough, you could hear messages that had never arrived. Sometimes the silence of the frontier seemed to echo back the intentions of those who had once walked it. The desire to own, to name, to mark, all absorbed and dissolved into the same patient earth. The land was not cruel, it was simply unbothered by time. In the early 20th century, when cars began to replace horses and electric light began to push deeper into rural towns, the wilderness remained untouched in the spaces between. Travelers on lonely highways spoke of feeling watched, not threatened, just observed, as though driving across something vast and sentient, something that knew its own history far better than they ever could. Even today, when satellites trace every contour and drones map every ridge, the frontier's quiet remains. The maps are perfect, but the feeling persists. The one that settles in just after sunset, when sound carries farther than it should, and the land seems to breathe again. Because the truth is simple, and the old historians perhaps understood it best, the frontier was never a place. It was a condition, of hope, of fear, of distance, of silence, and those things cannot be tamed. They wait patiently, even now, just beyond the last porch light. The wilderness, in its own way, outlived its people. It always does. By the time the 20th century began to hum with electricity, the frontier had already slipped out of reach. Yet, somehow, it continued to live, not in geography, but in imagination. Writers, photographers, and travelers carried the idea of the West like an ember cupped in their hands. Newspapers printed nostalgic accounts of the last pioneers, of wagon ruts still visible beneath modern roads, of empty cabins with doors that creaked open on their own. Painters found beauty in the decay, a kind of holiness in desolation. Every peeling wall, every rusted spur, every horizon swallowed by dust, seemed to whisper that something vast had once passed this way. The myth of the frontier did not die with its people. It transformed, slipping quietly from the real world into pages, photographs, and song. By the 1910s, the American West was already being rewritten as legend. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows turned history into theater, a careful choreography of memory, where gunfire, galloping horses, and painted sunsets made the past look noble, almost sacred. The audience, seated in neat rows under canvas tents, believed they were witnessing truth. Yet, the truth had long since wandered off into silence. Meanwhile, the frontier's physical remains faded further. Towns emptied, rails rusted. But every time someone described them, the story grew a little larger. Writers like Willa Cather, Owen Wister, and later, Wallace Stegner, painted the plains not as they were, but as they felt. Endless, patient, alive. The landscape itself became the main character, and in it, the quiet unease endured. Even in black and white photographs, the land refused to sit still. Images captured by Timothy O'Sullivan, Carlton Watkins, and Edward Curtis seemed to hold more than they showed. A single house against the sky, a line of fence posts disappearing into fog. These were not just records, they were reminders. Each image hummed faintly with what could not be seen, the invisible residue of lives once lived in isolation, the lingering pulse of something old and awake beneath the soil. The myth also grew darker. For every story of courage and exploration, there were others, quieter, buried deeper. Accounts of violence against indigenous nations, of treaties broken, of graves unmarked. Those too became part of the legend. Though in whispers and shadows, the land carried those memories as surely as it carried seeds. When wind moved across the plains, it brushed over both beauty and sorrow without discrimination. Tourists who traveled west in the 1930s and 1940s often wrote that they felt haunted by the spaces they found. Ghost towns half swallowed by sand, abandoned rail depots with doors that groaned open in the wind, a silence that felt less empty than full, thick with all that had been forgotten. It was this tension between what was remembered and what was erased that gave the myth its endurance. Every generation reimagined the frontier, polishing it until it shone again, then letting it tarnish once more. Cowboys became movie stars. The vast, indifferent sky became a stage for human longing. The dust became poetry. By the time Hollywood discovered the frontier, the myth had matured. John Ford's wide shots of Monument Valley did what the old explorers had done with maps. They drew the land again, but this time in light and shadow. The frontier was reborn as image, immense, remote, eternal, and yet beneath all that glory, the same stillness hummed, the same sense that something larger than human ambition was watching from just beyond the frame. Historians tried to explain why the myth persisted. Some said it was nostalgia, a longing for a simpler time that never really existed. Others called it denial, an effort to soften the violence that had forged expansion. But the truth was quieter and older. The myth endured because the land itself invited it. Stand in the middle of an open prairie at dusk, and it's easy to understand. The wind carries a low note that doesn't end. The horizon wavers like a memory, trying to return. Even now, in the 21st century, the same silence can still be found in the wide places. That same heavy, listening quiet that once made settlers whisper and soldiers look over their shoulders. Writers of the modern era, Annie Proulx, Cormac McCarthy, Barry Lopez, still feel its weight. Their pages echo with it, the loneliness, the vastness, the knowledge that time moves differently out there. The myth refuses to die, because it was never a lie. It was simply incomplete, a human attempt to name something that can't be named. For indigenous peoples whose stories stretch far deeper than the frontier myth, the persistence of the land is not mystery but memory. The wind's voice, the trembling of grass, the echo of hooves, all are reminders of a continuity that never ended. The frontier, as the settlers imagined it, was an interruption. But once that noise faded, the older rhythm returned, undiminished. The myth lives on because silence cannot be erased. The same winds that carried voices across the prairie now move through highways and power lines. The same stars that watched over wagon trains still glint above cities. The frontier has simply changed its costume. It no longer wears dust and lanterns, but glass and light. Yet it feels, somehow, the same. And late at night, when traffic slows and the hum of modern life softens, the old quiet drifts back in. It's there, under the sound of a train passing in the distance, in the tremor of wind against windows, in the spaces between our words. The land, patient as ever, remembers. The myth, in the end, was never just about the past. It was a mirror held up to the human need for mystery, for the feeling that something remains beyond understanding. The settlers may have fenced the earth, but they could never contain the dark. The frontier, real or imagined, will always exist wherever silence stretches farther than sight. Because some landscapes refuse to die, they simply go quiet until someone listens again. And when all the pioneers were gone, the wind returned to its old rhythm. Grass grew over trails, moonlight reclaimed the plains, and the land once again breathed without footsteps. Time has a way of erasing even the deepest marks. Fences sagged, gates rusted, paths once carved by wheels and boots dissolved into the earth. The wooden bones of homesteads folded inward, roofs collapsed gently, walls leaned toward the soil that once sustained them. No explosion of ruin, just quiet surrender. Where wagon ruts once led toward new horizons, there are only faint depressions now, visible in certain light, like wrinkles on the face of the land. Travelers who stumble across them in late afternoon often mistake them for shadows until they walk closer and feel the faint hollow beneath their feet. History softened, almost shy. The frontier had been a promise once of land, of freedom, of destiny, but promises fade, and the earth is patient. It had always been patient. Long after the shouting, the digging, the hammering stopped, the land began to hum again, softly, like something that had been holding its breath for centuries. At dusk, the plains turned silver. The light lingered longer than it should, catching in the tall grass, rippling across distant hills. In that strange half-light, the difference between sky and soil blurred. The horizon became a suggestion instead of a line. The frontier, once mapped and measured, melted back into its original state, endless, undefined. No one owns a night like that. Coyotes returned first, slipping through the ruins with casual grace, unbothered by what had come before. Deer wandered the old roads, pausing to stare into windows where human eyes once looked out. Birds nested in the frames of doorways, their songs thin but steady. Even the insects seemed louder, as though reclaiming frequencies once filled by the sound of saws and laughter. And somewhere in that vastness, the silence deepened into something whole. It wasn't absence, it was fullness, the kind of quiet that has texture, weight, and memory. A quiet that remembers voices, footsteps, the clatter of pans, the hiss of fire, and holds them gently, the way the ocean holds shells. At night, the stars returned to their old authority. No longer dimmed by the smoke of stoves or the haze of lamps, they glittered with unrestrained patience. Entire constellations that the settlers never learned the names of burned quietly above the plains. For centuries they had watched every attempt to divide the earth below, and now, with the same stillness, they watched it heal. In the wind's song, faint echoes remained, the ring of an axe at dusk, the creak of a wagon wheel, the sigh of a man looking toward a horizon that would never end. These sounds lived on, not as ghosts, but as patterns woven into the air like old threads. You could almost hear them if you listened long enough, if you stood still enough, and in some forgotten places, the ground still remembers names. Beneath layers of soil and root, beneath centuries of grass, small fragments remain. A buckle, a bottle, a stone arranged by human hands. Each one a whisper, each one proof that the land can absorb everything and still remain whole. Historians came later, notebooks in hand, measuring distances, cataloguing remains, but their words could never capture the feeling that lingered there, the hush that began just after sunset when the light turned blue and every sound carried farther than it should. It was not sadness, nor peace. It was something older than both. The equilibrium that existed before intrusion, restored once again. The frontier, that restless dream of movement and expansion, had ended not with conquest but with stillness. All the noise, the striving, the dust, it dissolved into the same silence that had preceded it. And as the earth settled, so too did its memory. Sometimes, travelers who camp along the old trails today speak of strange calm. They say the nights are unnervingly quiet, as if the air has grown heavy. Some describe feeling watched, not by eyes, but by time itself, an awareness that the ground beneath them has seen everything, and is content to see it all fade. The myth of the frontier still wanders, carried now not by wagons but by imagination. Yet even myths tire eventually. They too lie down in the grass. They too fall silent. And so the land returned to what it had always been, a living quiet. Grass bending under wind, rivers breathing through darkness, hills dreaming under the soft rhythm of stars. The same moonlight that once gleamed on rifles now gleams on nothing at all. The same horizon that drew millions of footsteps now waits untouched, patient, complete. When the night finally took it back, there was no resistance. Only a long exhale, the kind that happens when something ancient has finally been allowed to rest. The frontier was never truly conquered. It was only borrowed briefly by a species that mistook motion for permanence. The land has seen it all before, and will see it all again. Empires rise, fences fall, names fade, but the silence remains, constant and wide as the sky. And in that silence, if you close your eyes and listen, you might still hear it, the faint hum of wind over forgotten graves, the breathing of a world restored to itself. It is not lonely, it is not empty, it is simply home, as it was before the first lantern was lit, and as it will be long after the last one fades.